The story of Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, the man history would remember as Caligula, begins not with the thunder of armies or the clash of politics, but with the soft patter of a child's sandals in the Roman military camps along the Rhine. It is in these rugged encampments that we see the boy who would become emperor, toddling through rows of tents, the soldiers' laughter echoing as they nicknamed him, Caligula, Little Boots. He was the son of Germanicus, one of Rome's most beloved generals, and Agrippina the elder, the granddaughter of Augustus himself. From the start, Caligula's life was defined by paradox, cherished by the rank-and-file soldiers for his innocent presence, yet surrounded by the brutal machinery of war. The Rhine frontier was no playground. It was a living battlefield, dotted with scars of campaigns, where the air reeked of sweat, leather, and blood. And yet, in the middle of this martial chaos, the image of a boy dressed in miniature legionary gear softened the hearts of hardened soldiers. They cheered when he walked by, delighted by the sight of a general's son wearing tiny soldier's boots, unaware that this child's future would one day darken Rome itself. Germanicus was no ordinary commander. He was immensely popular, perhaps dangerously so in the eyes of the ruling emperor, Tiberius. When Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances in Antioch, whispers swept across the empire that he had been poisoned at Tiberius's command. For young Caligula, the loss of his father was more than personal tragedy, it was his first taste of the treachery that would haunt him throughout life. After Germanicus's death, Agrippina and her children, including Caligula, found themselves ensnared in a deadly web of imperial politics. Tiberius, suspicious and paranoid, kept a watchful eye on the descendants of Augustus. Agrippina, outspoken and fiercely protective, clashed with the emperor, earning herself exile. Caligula watched as his family was torn apart, 2 of his brothers arrested and starved to death, his mother banished. The boy who once danced among laughing soldiers now grew up with silence, loss, and suspicion pressing in on him from all sides. Caligula was eventually summoned to the island of Capri, where Tiberius had withdrawn into seclusion. To the outside world, Capri was a paradise, a lush island in the Bay of Naples, bathed in Mediterranean light. But within the walls of Tiberius's villa, Capri was a labyrinth of nightmares. Historians describe Tiberius's court as a place of paranoia, cruelty, and grotesque indulgence. Executions and accusations were daily fare. Senators trembled, servants whispered, and fear hung in the salt air like a mist. For Caligula, a teenager still forming his identity, Capri became both a cage and a crucible. He learned the language of survival: never trust, never speak too freely, always wear a mask. Suetonius tells us that Caligula mastered the art of deception there. Outwardly obedient, he concealed his anger and grief behind a polished facade. To Tiberius, he appeared loyal and harmless, yet inside, Caligula was absorbing every humiliation, every cruelty, storing it deep in the marrow of his being. Capri taught him that mercy was weakness, that power meant domination, and that survival required becoming more ruthless than one's enemies. By the time he left Capri, Caligula had shed the innocence of Little Boots. He had become a living paradox, adored by the Roman people as the heir of Germanicus, yet scarred by years under the gaze of a tyrant. To the public, he still seemed the Golden Prince, handsome and charismatic. Crowds cheered him in the streets, longing for him to restore the glory of Augustus's line. They saw in him the promise of renewal, a bright star against the darkening paranoia of Tiberius. But beneath that gleaming surface, another Caligula was taking shape, a young man who had witnessed betrayal as family tradition, cruelty as governance, and hypocrisy as survival. Every smile he offered hid clenched teeth. Every word of loyalty disguised his growing contempt. Capri had not only imprisoned him, it had forged him. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, the empire turned its eyes to Caligula. The boy who once waddled in miniature boots now stood on the precipice of ultimate power. The soldiers who had once cheered at his childish outfit were now grown men ready to swear allegiance to him. The people remembered his father Germanicus and saw in Caligula his resurrection. They celebrated him as a symbol of hope, a new dawn after years of Tiberius's shadows. But those closest to Caligula knew a darker truth: the island of Capri had not left him untouched. It had planted seeds of suspicion, cruelty, and unquenchable hunger for power. As he stepped into the role of emperor, he carried with him both the adoration of the masses and the ghosts of his youth. The tale of Little Boots is not merely a charming anecdote of a child among soldiers. It is the prologue to one of history's darkest reigns. It shows us a boy who began as a beloved symbol of innocence, but whose life was shaped by poison, exile, and terror. To understand Caligula the emperor, we must first see Caligula the child, shaped by soldiers' laughter, scarred by family tragedy, and molded in the crucible of Capri. For in those formative years, the mask was born. And behind that mask, waiting patiently, was the shadow that would one day engulf Rome. When the news spread that Emperor Tiberius was dead, a wave of relief swept through Rome like a cleansing storm. For years, the empire had lived under the shadow of the reclusive tyrant, his name synonymous with suspicion, cruelty, and endless trials. Now, suddenly, that suffocating weight seemed to lift. Into that vacuum of fear and exhaustion stepped the man the people had long been waiting for, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, Caligula, the boy once called Little Boots, now returning as the Golden Prince of Rome. To the crowds, he was not merely a new emperor, he was the son of Germanicus, the symbol of everything noble and just, a living echo of the dynasty of Augustus. The moment he entered the city, the people poured into the streets in a frenzy of celebration. Senators, who had lived in terror of Tiberius's suspicion, welcomed him with honeyed words and promises of loyalty. Soldiers, who still remembered his tiny boots on the frontiers, shouted his name with unrestrained devotion. Women wept as though a savior had descended among them. Even hardened men who had endured the cruelty of Capri believed that at last, Rome was to be reborn. At first, Caligula seemed to embody every dream. He lifted oppressive taxes, released prisoners, and recalled the exiled. He paid homage to his ancestors, organized games, and spread lavish gifts to the people. The Senate, relieved and eager to please, declared him the most gracious ruler since Augustus himself. Rome felt as though spring had come after a long and bitter winter. The young emperor walked among the citizens like a god cloaked in humanity. His presence seemed radiant, his words carefully chosen to charm and reassure. The people adored him with a kind of madness, chanting his name in the streets and showering him with prayers. For the first time in years, there was laughter in the forum, songs in the taverns, and whispers of hope in the households of Rome. Caligula appeared to be everything his father had been and more, youthful, vigorous, merciful, and destined to bring light where Tiberius had left shadows. Yet behind this dazzling mask lay the scars of Capri. Years of watching cruelty had etched themselves into Caligula's soul. He knew better than anyone that kindness was a tool, that generosity could be the sharpest weapon. Every coin he scattered to the people was a chain he forged around their hearts. Every gesture of mercy was calculated to tighten the devotion. Rome believed it was seeing the rebirth of the age of Augustus, but Caligula knew he was staging a performance. The boy who had once been forced to smile through his family's destruction had become a man who could smile even as he concealed the darkest thoughts. In the palace, his first days as emperor were filled with calculated brilliance. He honored Tiberius in public while privately cursing his name. He embraced the Senate with warmth even as he studied them for signs of disloyalty. He visited the temples, knelt before the gods, and played the role of pious son of Rome, while inside he weighed the power of divinity for himself. All the lessons of Capri, how to wear a mask, how to survive by deception, how to bend others with appearances, now became the foundation of his reign. And Rome, blinded by its desire for salvation, saw only what it wanted to see, a golden prince, a savior born from suffering. But whispers began to stir, subtle at first, like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Caligula's generosity was not sustainable, his extravagance draining the treasury faster than it could be filled. His laughter at banquets sometimes lingered too long, his eyes flashing with a coldness that unsettled even his closest advisors. Servants whispered that he prowled the halls at night, restless, unable to sleep, haunted by shadows only he could see. The people still adored him, but those within the palace began to wonder, was this radiant emperor truly the man they thought, or had Rome placed its hope in a figure shaped by grief, rage, and secrets too dark to name? The Golden Prince returned to Rome not as a child in tiny boots but as a man with the empire at his feet. For the masses, he was the fulfillment of every dream, the dawn after endless night. But in truth, he carried within him the darkness of Capri, the mask of obedience that had now become second nature, and a hunger for power that no amount of adoration could ever satisfy. Rome celebrated him as its savior, but unknowingly, it had crowned the shadow that would soon consume it. In the beginning, Caligula wore the mask of mercy with skill, but as months turned into years, the mask began to slip, and what lay beneath was something far more disturbing. Having tasted the sweetness of absolute devotion, he began to wonder why he should settle for being a mere man. Was he not the son of Germanicus, heir to Augustus, chosen by destiny itself? In the echoing marble halls of the Palatine, Caligula's thoughts twisted into dangerous dreams. He started to imagine himself not only as emperor but as a god incarnate, walking among mortals, entitled to their worship and sacrifices. The signs appeared slowly at first. He began to demand honors usually reserved for the divine, his statues placed in temples, his name invoked in prayers. Senators bent low, too frightened to protest, and priests who once served Jupiter now found themselves pouring libations before Caligula's image. He draped himself in radiant robes, gold stitched into the very fabric, jewels glittering in the light of the torches. At feasts, he would emerge dressed as Apollo, a lyre in his hands, or as Mercury with winged sandals. Sometimes he even appeared as Venus, adorned in flowing silks, painted and perfumed, daring his court to laugh as he blurred the lines of gender and sanctity. To Caligula, every costume was not mere play acting, it was revelation, a glimpse of the god he believed himself to be. The people murmured, unsure whether to adore or recoil. Some whispered that perhaps he truly was divine, for how else could he command such power, inspire such terror? Others muttered of blasphemy, of a mortal mocking the eternal gods. But no one dared speak too loudly. The emperor's ears were everywhere, and the punishment for doubt was swift. As his delusions grew, so did his cruelty. He had learned in Capri that fear was a sharper blade than any sword, and now he wielded it with ease. Senators who hesitated to worship him found themselves stripped of titles, their wealth confiscated, their families ruined. Nobles were summoned to his banquets only to be humiliated in front of hundreds, ordered to dance like slaves or fight like gladiators for his amusement. And all the while, Caligula's laughter rang through the halls, high, sharp, and merciless. But perhaps the most shocking of his proclamations came when he announced that he intended to build a temple devoted not to Jupiter, not to Mars, but to himself. Within it, priests would serve only Caligula, sacrifices would be offered in his name, and the people of Rome would bow before the living god. To ensure obedience, he demanded that his statue be placed in the sacred temple of Jerusalem, a command that nearly set the eastern provinces aflame. To Caligula, resistance was unthinkable, he was the divine ruler of the world, and the world must kneel. At night, he wandered the palace speaking to the gods as though they were old companions. He claimed to dine with the shades of his ancestors, Augustus and Julius Caesar themselves, laughing and arguing with shadows in the flickering torchlight. Servants, creeping silently through the corridors, heard his voice rising in rage and then collapsing into manic laughter, as though the emperor debated with unseen deities. Was he truly conversing with spirits, or had madness taken root in his mind? None could say for certain, but those who listened at the edges of the darkness carried whispers of a man who no longer walked entirely in the world of men. And yet, in this strange divinity he claimed, there was method. By presenting himself as more than mortal, Caligula tightened his grip on the empire. To defy him was not merely treason, it was sacrilege. To resist him was to defy a god. This was power beyond politics, beyond armies. It was the power of belief, twisted and corrupted to serve one man's insatiable hunger. Rome had once celebrated the Golden Prince who promised mercy and renewal. Now, it beheld a figure swathed in silks and jewels, demanding worship, punishing hesitation, reveling in humiliation. What had begun as hope was transforming into dread. The dreams of the gods that Caligula so openly embraced were not dreams at all, but nightmares that crept into the very soul of the empire. For the boy who had once been cheered by soldiers as little boots had become something far more dangerous. He no longer sought the love of the people, he demanded their worship. And Rome, caught between devotion and terror, could only watch as the man it had crowned as savior revealed himself as a god who hungered endlessly, and a tyrant who would stop at nothing to feed that hunger. The mask of mercy had long since fallen away, and in its place Caligula revealed a new identity, not as a mortal ruler but as a living god who demanded worship, obedience, and sacrifice. It began quietly, with visions whispered to his inner circle, tales of nightly conversations with Jupiter, Venus, and Diana. He spoke of the gods not as a supplicant but as an equal, a brother in the divine order. And from these midnight revelations, he claimed to draw the right to transcend the boundaries of human decency. What followed was a systematic corruption of every sacred tradition Rome had held for centuries. During the festival of Lupercalia, once a celebration of fertility and the renewal of life, Caligula twisted the rites into ceremonies of blasphemy. Deep within the marble halls of the palace, beneath the flickering light of oil lamps and clouds of incense, he gathered senators, generals, and wealthy citizens who dared not refuse the emperor's summons. There, he inverted every sacred rule. Priests who once practiced celibacy were ordered to break their vows in acts of degradation. Rituals that once separated the sacred from the profane were deliberately blended into obscene spectacles. But most shocking of all was his declaration that family bonds, so carefully guarded by Roman law and tradition, meant nothing to one who had ascended into godhood. His three sisters, Agrippina, Drusilla, and Livilla, were drawn into the center of his twisted pageantry. Caligula proclaimed that the gods themselves knew no such human limitations, that the pharaohs of Egypt had preserved the divinity through incestuous unions, and that his own bloodline demanded the same. The witnesses, trembling and unable to look away, later confessed that what unfolded shattered boundaries that had endured for 8 centuries of Roman life. His sisters were not victims in private but spectacles in public ceremonies where Rome's elite watched in horrified silence, their fear of defiance stronger than their revulsion. As the months passed, the ceremonies grew darker, more elaborate. Prominent Romans were selected as offerings, not to the gods of Olympus, but to Caligula himself. Senators with beautiful wives, generals with young daughters, noblemen with carefully guarded reputations were summoned and stripped of the dignity. Refusal meant death, but participation meant something worse, the obliteration of everything they believed about honor, family, and the natural order of the world. The emperor reduced them to instruments of his will, breaking them not only in body but in spirit. By compelling them to commit acts so shameful that they could never speak of them aloud, he bound them to him with invisible chains of complicity. The turning point came during the festival of Saturnalia in December of the year 40. What had once been Rome's most joyous celebration, a week when the order of society was playfully inverted and masters served their slaves, became under Caligula's hand a theater of degradation. In the grand banquet hall, beneath frescoes celebrating the noble deeds of Augustus, the emperor presided over scenes that twisted Rome's identity beyond recognition. He forced respected consuls to watch their wives and children degraded before the court. Senators, some of them gray-haired pillars of tradition, were ordered into acts so profane that later generations refused even to record them in writing. And there stood Caligula, draped in the robes of Venus, crowned with flowers, presiding not as a man but as a parody of divinity, his laughter echoing off the marble walls as Rome's guardians of virtue were broken one by one. But it was his obsession with Drusilla, his beloved sister and proclaimed divine consort, that revealed the full depth of his descent. When she died suddenly in 38, perhaps from the toll of his demands, Caligula's grief erupted into new forms of blasphemy. He declared her a goddess, built temples in her honor, and commanded that Romans worship her as they did Diana or Minerva. Yet his devotion did not stop at statues and hymns. In secret ceremonies, he claimed to commune with her spirit, and whispers spread that these rites involved her very remains, preserved and desecrated in acts that violated every law of gods and men. The Praetorian Guard, sworn to protect him with their lives, began to turn in disgust. Cassius Chaerea, their commander, a hardened veteran of Rome's campaigns, could no longer reconcile loyalty with the horrors he witnessed. Even those who had tolerated his cruelty began to meet in secret, senators and soldiers alike, their stomachs sickened not only by the emperor's lust but by the realization that Rome itself was being unmade in these ceremonies. Caligula's palace had ceased to be the heart of an empire, it had become a temple of shame, a place where boundaries collapsed and power was measured only in how thoroughly he could destroy the dignity of those around him. In the silence that followed Drusilla's death, Caligula's madness seemed to swell like a tide, reaching into every chamber of the palace. The ceremonies no longer sought to imitate the gods, they sought to replace them entirely. Rome's traditions, once the anchor of its greatness, had been turned into weapons of control. Senators who had participated could no longer speak of virtue without choking on their own memories. Generals who had surrendered their families could never command their soldiers without the ghost of humiliation shadowing their orders. And the people, who once cheered the Golden Prince, had become unwilling participants in a performance that turned their faith into complicity. In less than 4 years, Caligula transformed the empire into a theater of divine madness. He proved that the fastest way to break a civilization was not by conquering its borders but by desecrating its most sacred beliefs. His perverse ceremonies were not merely indulgences, they were calculated instruments of domination. Shame, not fear, became his ultimate weapon, binding Rome to him with cords no sword could sever. And though daggers would one day cut him down in the very corridors where these rites had taken place, the poison he poured into the heart of Rome would linger for generations, whispered in the shadows as a warning of how swiftly power can twist into depravity when a man convinces himself he is a god. By the winter of 40 AD, the fragile illusion of Caligula's mercy had shattered, and what remained was an emperor who no longer sought merely to shock but to dominate the very soul of Rome. Saturnalia, the most sacred and joyous of Roman festivals, had for centuries been a celebration of equality, laughter, and the playful inversion of social order. Masters dined with their slaves, children sang in the streets, and the city pulsed with a rare spirit of freedom. Under Caligula, that joyous spirit was twisted into something monstrous, a theater of degradation that left even hardened men unable to sleep without trembling. In the banquet halls of the Palatine, beneath frescoes that once depicted the noble deeds of Augustus, Caligula presided dressed in the robes of Venus, crowned with flowers, his face painted as though mocking both gods and mortals. Senators, consuls, and generals were summoned, their families dragged with them, and none dared refuse. The emperor commanded them to abandon the dignity, to perform before hundreds in spectacles that blurred the sacred with the obscene. Respected consuls were forced to watch their wives shamed before the court. Elderly senators were compelled into acts that violated not only Roman law but the very foundations of human decency. Every laugh that escaped Caligula's lips echoed like a curse across the marble walls, reminding all who stood before him that resistance meant death, but obedience meant the death of the soul. It was here that his obsession with Drusilla, his beloved sister and self-declared divine consort, reached its most horrifying expression. When she died unexpectedly, perhaps from the toll of his demands, Caligula's grief warped into something even more grotesque than his lust had been. He proclaimed her a goddess, ordering temples built in her honor, her image worshipped beside Diana and Minerva. In ceremonies that followed, he claimed to commune with her spirit, whispering in dark chambers that his love had transcended mortal limits. Whispers spread that her remains themselves had been desecrated, woven into rituals that left participants sick with terror. The line between devotion and blasphemy collapsed, and even those who had tolerated his excesses recoiled. Among the Praetorian Guard, the men sworn to protect him with their lives, disgust grew into silent conspiracy. Cassius Chaerea, a veteran hardened by decades of war, could no longer reconcile loyalty with the abominations he was forced to witness. The palace had become less a seat of empire than a temple of shame, where Rome's proudest men were reduced to husks, broken by humiliation more enduring than the lash. Senators who once spoke proudly of virtue now carried eyes hollow with memory. Generals who commanded legions in the field returned to their troops with voices cracked by degradation. Rome itself seemed poisoned, not by foreign conquest, but by the emperor's deliberate corruption of its deepest traditions. Drusilla's death did not end his madness, it magnified it. Her apotheosis, forced upon the people, became another tool of domination. To doubt her divinity was treason, to resist her worship was blasphemy. Citizens found themselves bowing not only before Caligula but before the ghost of his desire, drawn into a cycle of worship that bound them tighter than chains. By warping Saturnalia, by desecrating his sister's memory, by forcing Rome to play along in this grotesque performance, Caligula had achieved something more enduring than fear. He had taught an empire that shame itself could be a weapon, sharper and more binding than steel. The Saturnalia of 40 AD did more than dishonor a festival. It broke Rome's sense of who it was. And in that breaking, the seeds of conspiracy sprouted. For those who had once cheered the Golden Prince now saw clearly, the boy of little boots had not grown into Augustus reborn, but into a living reminder that when a man convinces himself he is a god, the first thing he destroys is the humanity of everyone around him. By the end of the year 40 AD, whispers in Rome's corridors had become dangerous murmurs. Senators, guardsmen, and even palace servants no longer spoke of Caligula as a man at all, but as something unholy, a creature who mocked the gods he claimed to embody. Fear still held their tongues in public, but in private, behind locked doors and hushed curtains, words like deliverance and assassination began to surface. For all the dread he inspired, his reign of humiliation had pushed even the most loyal beyond endurance. The Praetorian Guard had been the first to falter. They had sworn blood oaths to defend the emperor with their lives, yet every night they were forced to watch ceremonies that twisted their sense of honor into disgust. Veterans of a dozen campaigns, men who had seen comrades butchered in Germanic forests, now found themselves recoiling from what they witnessed in the palace chambers. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, a man too seasoned to flinch in battle, grew silent and grim. Each act of degradation carved itself deeper into his conscience until his loyalty felt like complicity. He knew that to protect Caligula any longer was to betray Rome itself. Among the senators, the air was just as heavy. These were men who had tolerated the excesses of emperors before, Tiberius's paranoia, Augustus's manipulation, but what Caligula demanded was something new, something that struck at the very foundation of their identity. It was not simply cruelty, but the methodical erasure of dignity. Senators who had bowed before him in mock worship could never again speak of Roman honor without choking on their shame. They realized too late that his rituals were not random madness but deliberate tools of power. And so, stripped of pride, they looked toward daggers for redemption. The conspiracy did not form from ambition but from revulsion. It was not a single meeting, but a series of silent nods, furtive glances, and quiet agreements whispered in shadowed porticos. Chaerea became its reluctant leader, joined by senators who had endured enough and freedmen of the palace who had seen too much. Even members of Caligula's own household staff, broken by years of witnessing his ceremonies, lent their support. Each man carried scars, and each believed that killing the emperor was the only way to cleanse himself of them. Yet, the danger of discovery was immense. Caligula's paranoia was matched only by his cruelty. Informers lingered everywhere, and one careless word could lead to execution. The conspirators met in secret, never all together, never in the same place twice. Plans shifted, narrowed, then sharpened into a single resolve, to strike swiftly and without warning, before Caligula could twist Saturnalia's corruption into something worse, before he could extend his degradations to every noble family in Rome. What united them was not only a desire for survival but for silence. They did not wish to shout their intentions to the masses, nor to rally the city in rebellion. They wanted only to end the nightmare that had seeped into Rome's heart. And so they prepared for the unthinkable, not rebellion, not civil war, but murder in the emperor's own halls. The day chosen was January 24, 41 AD. Caligula would return from yet another private ceremony in honor of Drusilla, still lost in the haze of his delusions. The conspirators would wait in the palace corridors, the same marble tunnels that had echoed with the laughter of his grotesque rites. There, in the shadow of statues meant to remind Rome of its greatness, they would take from him the thing he had stolen from them, the dignity of being human. As the plan solidified, each man understood the cost. To strike at the emperor was to strike at a god, or at least at the man who believed himself one. If they failed, their families would be destroyed, their names erased, their bodies left to rot in disgrace. But to do nothing was worse, for Caligula's madness showed no sign of ending. Each ceremony grew darker, each humiliation deeper, until the conspirators could no longer imagine a Rome with him still alive. And so they placed their trust not in prayers, nor in law, but in steel. The end came not in a blaze of public defiance but in a quiet corridor beneath the marble ceilings where Caligula had performed his most degrading rites. On January 24, 41 AD, the emperor returned from a private ceremony in honor of Drusilla, still intoxicated by his own visions of divinity. Waiting in the shadows were the men who had once sworn to guard his life, the Praetorian Guard, now transformed into his executioners. Cassius Chaerea struck first, his blade sinking into Caligula's chest. 29 more wounds followed, each conspirator demanding to feel the emperor's blood on his own hands, as if only shared violence could wash away years of complicity. In those moments, the boy once called Little Boots ceased to exist. But killing Caligula did not kill what he had unleashed. The conspirators searched his chambers and found meticulous records written in his own hand, documenting every ritual, every participant, every degradation. There were plans for future ceremonies, schemes to extend his divine requirements into every noble family of Rome. Claudius, his uncle and soon-to-be emperor, ordered the records burned. Yet fragments survived, whispered through the nightmares of those who had seen too much. The official histories would later dismiss Caligula as mad, a tragic consequence of absolute power corrupting an unstable mind. Madness was easier to accept, easier to contain. But those who had lived through his reign knew better. They had witnessed the methodical precision with which he orchestrated every act. Caligula was not insane. He was something far more terrifying, a brilliant man who discovered that shame was the most powerful weapon ever forged. In the months following his assassination, survivors began to speak. Their testimonies revealed a grim pattern. Every perversion, every violation served a purpose beyond pleasure. Caligula had weaponized virtue itself, turning Rome's most sacred traditions into instruments of control. Senators who once prided themselves on honor were left unable to speak of it without hearing the echo of their own degradation. Generals who offered wives and daughters to his rituals could never again command respect without recalling their humiliation. Even ordinary citizens, who had cheered what they thought were divine ceremonies, discovered too late that they had become unwitting participants in their own moral destruction. Claudius tried to cleanse the palace. Holy water was sprinkled through its chambers, priests were summoned to drive out the stain of blasphemy, but nothing could erase what had been done. The marble walls remembered. The stories spread, carried by traumatized witnesses, turning into whispered legends that would ripple through the empire for generations. Nero, Commodus, Caracalla, all would draw inspiration from fragments of Caligula's methods, though none would replicate the systematic precision with which he had corrupted an entire civilization. What unsettled Rome most in the aftermath was the realization that his methods had worked. He had ruled less than 4 years, yet he left behind an empire more compliant, more fearful, more willing to accept that some powers existed beyond the reach of law or conscience. The Republic's ancient virtues, already weakened, had been deliberately poisoned by a young man who understood that conquest was unnecessary when the soul of a civilization could be broken from within. 2,000 years later, historians still struggle to comprehend the scope of what Caligula unleashed in those perfumed chambers. His reign forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth: the distance between order and chaos, between virtue and depravity, is not measured in centuries or borders, but in the single moment when someone with absolute power decides the boundaries no longer apply to them. The boy who once wore miniature boots in Germanic camps became the emperor who proved that shame, not fear, is the ultimate instrument of control. And though the whispers of those marble corridors have long since faded, their echo lingers, in every palace, every parliament, every chamber of power where men convince themselves that crowns make them gods.